Jackson Monroe had always thought of himself as a digital cowboy. It wasn't that he had any real affection for the Wild West, or even rode horses. No, it was the idea of being a lone wolf, a code wrangler in the vast, neon-lit desert of cyberspace. He'd hacked into government servers before breakfast and cracked corporate firewalls before lunch, all while sipping stale coffee and wearing a hoodie that hadn't seen a laundry machine in weeks. Today, though, things felt a little off. Jackson was at his desk, scrolling through his screen, watching a YouTube video about cats wearing sunglasses. He laughed to himself, fingers flying over his keyboard. Nothing was urgent, nothing ever was, at least not in the way that it mattered to him. But today, the air felt different. Maybe it was the buzzing in his skull, the static hum that seemed to vibrate through the floor and into his bones. Or maybe it was the strange stillness of the city outside his window. Usually, by now, the sidewalks would be packed with people rushing to their next meetings or heading home for lunch. Today, however, there was no one. He shook his head, brushing off the sensation as paranoia, maybe a little too much caffeine. Then, his phone buzzed. The message was simple, but the urgency of it made his heart skip a beat. The dream virus. It's spreading. We need you. Jackson stared at the screen, the words unclear at first. He didn't respond immediately, his mind racing. The dream virus? He'd heard the name in passing, mentioned on the news, or whispered in the tech underground, but no one had taken it seriously. He typed out a quick response, his fingers moving quickly. This a joke? The reply came in seconds. No. This is real. Get to the lab. Now. The lab, a high-security tech facility run by the government, was only a few blocks away. He had no reason not to trust the message. So, against his better judgment, against the strange sensation that was creeping over him like a thick fog, he grabbed his jacket, slammed his laptop shut, and made his way out the door. As he stepped onto the street, the weirdness intensified. There were still no people in sight, but now it wasn't just the absence of life that unnerved him, it was the stillness of everything. The buildings, tall and glassy, reflected the morning sunlight in an almost too perfect way. The air was still, as if the whole city had hit pause. He quickened his pace, but as he passed a cafe, something strange happened. A man, seemingly in his mid-40s, was standing outside, holding a cup of coffee, frozen mid-sip. Jackson walked past him, then stopped and turned around. "Hey! You okay?" he called out. The man didn't move. Not even a twitch. He was perfectly still, as if the world around him had simply ceased to exist. Jackson glanced around. No one else was moving. His heart rate spiked, adrenaline flooding his veins. Something was seriously wrong. He pulled out his phone and tried calling his colleague, Eleanor, but the call wouldn't go through. He tried again, then again. Nothing. A few blocks down, he reached the tech facility. As he entered, he was greeted by the usual security guard, an older woman named Carol. "Morning," Jackson said, flashing his ID. She didn't respond. Carol was frozen in place, her gaze fixed on the wall as if in deep thought, but her posture was stiff, almost mechanical. "Carol?" Jackson stepped closer, his pulse racing now. This wasn't a glitch. Something was happening, and it was happening to everyone around him. He pushed through the doors into the lab, where the head of the operation, a scientist named Dr. Lydia Hamilton, awaited him. Lydia looked up from a glowing computer monitor, her face illuminated by the data pouring across the screen. "You came," she said, though her voice had an odd flatness to it. "We don't have much time." "What's going on, Lydia?" Jackson asked, scanning the room, taking in the hundreds of screens displaying lines of code, blinking data, and charts. "What's this dream virus?" "We're still investigating," Lydia said, her eyes darting to the screen. "But it's worse than we thought. People in the virtual spaces, they're falling unconscious. In the real world, too." People who were logged into VR systems, everyone's asleep. A collective coma, as if their minds were trapped somewhere. Wait, trapped? In a virtual world? Jackson ran a hand through his hair, incredulous. That sounds insane. It's not, Lydia insisted. The virus isn't just a computer bug. It's something alive, Jackson. A force that's been created from something deeper. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Deeper? Like a virus from a code or something? Lydia shook her head, her eyes narrowing. No. Worse. It's coming from within. The subconscious. The collective human subconscious. Okay, Jackson rubbed his temples. Are we talking about some kind of AI, an algorithm gone haywire? No, it's something more insidious. A living, breathing entity born from our own minds. It's taking over the virtual world and feeding back into reality. It's adapting, growing. Before Jackson could respond, the monitor in front of Lydia flickered, flashing a strange symbol. Then, the image on the screen began to distort, shifting into an image Jackson couldn't quite comprehend. Faces melted into one another, becoming twisted, grotesque. What the hell is that? He muttered. That's it, Lydia said, her voice laced with terror. That's the virus. It's forming. Jackson leaned closer, transfixed by the creature on the screen. It seemed to move, shifting from one monstrous shape to another, as if it was learning, evolving. At times it was a cloud of shadows, at others a grotesque combination of human faces and distorted memories. That's impossible, Jackson whispered, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. It's like some kind of nightmare, but how? It's our dreams, Lydia said. Our nightmares. The more people use these virtual worlds, the more they disconnect from their own emotions. Their unresolved fears, their traumas, they've been stored, repressed. Now they've taken shape. Jackson felt his stomach churn. He was no stranger to virtual spaces, to the way people got lost in them, but this was something far darker than he could have imagined. The virus was not a piece of code, it was a creature born from the darkest recesses of the collective human mind. Why haven't we been able to stop it? Jackson asked, his voice low. We thought we could contain it at first, Lydia replied, biting her lip. But it's spreading faster than we can track it. Every time we isolate it in one part of the system, it shows up somewhere else. It's like it's alive, Jackson. It's learning from us. Jackson's mind raced. The virus wasn't just a virus, not by any stretch of the imagination. It was something far worse, something more profound. His pulse quickened as he processed Lydia's words, trying to wrap his mind around what she was saying. It felt like the ground was slipping away from him, like they were standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into a void. Lydia's fingers danced across the keyboard, typing commands with rapid precision, but Jackson could see the way her hand trembled, the flicker of doubt in her eyes. The screens in front of her pulsed with new data, but it wasn't helping them understand what they were up against. What do we do now? Jackson asked, his voice tight. How do we stop it? We're trying to figure that out, Lydia said. But the deeper we go into the virtual world, the worse it gets. The virus, it's not just spreading through the systems anymore. It's merging with the human mind. Great, Jackson muttered, stepping away from the monitor. So, it's a full-on apocalypse. But how do we fight something that's inside our heads? That doesn't make any sense. It's exactly why it's so dangerous, Lydia said, her voice shaking. We're up against something that's both code and human. It's built on our own subconscious, our desires, our fears, our hidden thoughts. The more people plug into these virtual systems, the more they're feeding the virus with their own minds. And the more it grows. Jackson rubbed his eyes, trying to process. He'd heard of AI that learned from human input, but this was something else entirely. Something more insidious, like a parasite feeding off human nature itself. He glanced at the screens again, trying to focus on the data. The virus had already infiltrated the servers in multiple zones that were supposed to be locked off, encrypted, protected from outside interference. But this thing wasn't a typical security breach. It was evolving and adapting in ways they couldn't predict. It was taking on a life of its own. Are there any leads? Jackson asked. Somewhere we can start looking? A point of origin? Lydia didn't look at him right away. Instead, she stared at the screen, her fingers still moving across the keys with a mix of hope and desperation. Finally, she met his eyes. We've traced it back to a central node, she said quietly. But it's not what we expected. The node isn't just a piece of hardware, it's a neural interface. It's connected to the minds of the people who've been using the system the most. Jackson froze. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. You mean, the virus is actually living inside people's heads? It's feeding off their thoughts? Not just their thoughts, Lydia corrected, her voice taking on a more solemn tone. Their dreams. Their subconscious. The words hit Jackson like a slap. The very idea of a virus existing not in the tangible world but in the intangible, elusive realm of the mind was unfathomable. And yet, the more Lydia spoke, the more it started to make a kind of twisted sense. Virtual worlds, these immersive, all-consuming simulations, were supposed to be a sanctuary, a place to escape. But what if those sanctuaries had become prisons? What if, by stepping into these spaces, humanity had opened the door to their darkest instincts, their repressed fears? How do we get to this node? Jackson asked, the need to act already pushing him forward. His instincts were kicking in, a familiar, almost reckless urge to solve the problem, to fix whatever broken thing he could find. There's a portal, Lydia said, her voice full of dread. But it's not a normal portal. It's embedded in the virtual world, buried deep in the code. Only a few people even know it exists. It's not meant to be used. Not by anyone. Jackson narrowed his eyes. You've been there? Lydia hesitated. For a moment, it seemed like she wasn't going to answer, but then she nodded. Once, she said softly. I had to. When the virus first started showing signs of activity, I thought I could control it. I thought I could study it, understand it, keep it contained. But once I entered that space, I felt it. It was like something had unlocked inside me. Something I didn't even know was there. Jackson frowned. What do you mean? Lydia met his gaze, her expression pained. I mean, I didn't just feel the virus in the virtual space. I felt it inside me. It's as if it was drawing out my own fears, my own weaknesses, and turning them against me. The deeper I went, the stronger it became. It didn't just want to control the virtual world. It wanted to control us. All of us. Jackson felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't sure he believed in ghosts or supernatural forces, but what Lydia described was something far worse, a malevolent force taking shape from the minds of human beings. He thought of the twisted, shifting monster they'd seen on the screens earlier, the creature that morphed and contorted, a visual manifestation of the human psyche gone horribly wrong. What happened when you tried to leave? Jackson asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it anyway. Lydia's face grew pale. It wouldn't let me. I had to fight to escape. And when I did, she stopped herself, her mouth closing as if she was afraid to say what was on her mind. When you did, you brought something back with you, Jackson finished for her. She didn't deny it. Jackson knew what that meant. The virus had already started to spread into their world, leaking out from the virtual realm. It had found a way to influence reality, to take root in the human mind itself. And if they didn't stop it soon, it would consume everything. Let's go, Jackson said, determination creeping into his voice. He wasn't sure what they were walking into, but he knew they had no other choice. We're going in. together. Lydia nodded, standing up from her desk. Her expression was unreadable, but the fear in her eyes was impossible to miss. She led the way down a narrow corridor to a back room. The room was dimly lit, with cables snaking across the floor, connecting various servers and terminals. But the centerpiece was a sleek, black chair, fitted with a helmet-like device that looked like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. "It's a neural interface," Lydia explained, her voice tense. "Once you plug in, you're fully immersed. No difference between reality and virtuality." Jackson stared at the chair, swallowing hard. "And if I don't make it back?" Lydia's lips tightened, and for a moment, she looked as if she might say something comforting, but then the words seemed to die in her throat. Instead, she simply nodded. "I'll make sure you get out," she said. Jackson sat down in the chair. His fingers brushed against the cold, metal armrests. The helmet was lowered over his head, and within seconds, the world around him disappeared. The instant the helmet clicked into place, Jackson felt his mind being tugged forward, like the beginning of a dive into cold, deep water. His vision blurred, then reassembled itself into something he could recognize, yet it wasn't quite the same. The sterile lab he'd just left vanished entirely, replaced by a shimmering, shifting landscape. The air smelled faintly of burnt circuits and something metallic. The ground beneath him was smooth, almost like glass, but it was alive with movement. Small, glowing lines appeared and disappeared, forming strange patterns across the surface. Jackson blinked and took a deep breath, realizing that it didn't feel like breathing at all. It felt more like he was experiencing the act of breathing without actually doing it. His body had ceased to exist here, he was only his mind, navigating through a digital space that bent and flexed with the flick of an internal switch. He felt a tug at his consciousness, a pull toward something, or someone, or somewhere. Lydia had warned him that once inside, it wouldn't just be about tracking the virus anymore. The deeper they went into the code, the more difficult it would become to differentiate between the virtual and the real. His first steps took him into a vast, open space. The sky overhead was a deep, unnatural shade of purple, streaked with bands of gold. The horizon was indistinct, as though it was simultaneously right in front of him and miles away. In the distance, he could see shapes, figures moving, figures frozen, and some that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. "Lydia," he called out. His voice, or what felt like his voice, echoed but didn't sound quite right, as though it was bouncing off something intangible. His words hung in the air, waiting to dissipate. There was no response. Jackson's mind raced. It was clear now. The virus had infected this space on a much deeper level than anyone could have predicted. This wasn't just a world that mirrored reality, it was a world shaped by it, a world forged from humanity's subconscious. And just like the virus, it had no rules, no logic. Everything here was fluid, ever-shifting. Jackson could feel the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him, as if they were distorting the environment around him. He took another step, and the ground beneath him trembled, then cracked open in a jagged line. From the fissure, something rose, a shape, a shadow, flickering and distorted. It wasn't human, at least not in any form he recognized. The creature loomed over him, its body a conglomeration of abstract, twisting shapes, its face unnatural. It looked like something between a nightmare and an old friend, a reflection of everything Jackson had ever feared. A phantom that danced at the edges of his mind. "Not again," he muttered, taking a step back, his body instinctively tensing. The virus, this living thing, was directly connected to his own subconscious now. Whatever it was becoming here, it was feeding off his own thoughts, just like it had fed off the others. He wasn't just here to track it, he was here to face it, to understand it, and in some twisted sense, to confront it. The creature's face shifted, melting into something else entirely, a woman's face, his mother's face, distorted, her expression one of pain, of loss. Jackson's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. He had not thought about her in years, yet here she was, or something like her, twisted into a mockery of everything he had repressed. "Jackson," the creature whispered, its voice an eerie echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You can never escape me." Jackson clenched his fists, fighting against the rising tide of panic. This was exactly what Lydia had warned him about. The deeper he went, the more the virus would feed on his own buried fears, on his doubts and regrets. The creature had taken shape from the very essence of his own suppressed memories. "No," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You're not real. You're just a reflection. A trick." But the creature only smiled, if you could call it a smile, and advanced, its twisted form writhing like it was made of smoke and shadows. It didn't speak again. Instead, it reached out with what looked like 1,000 hands, each one extending toward him like an invitation, or maybe a threat. Jackson's mind screamed in protest, but his body stayed still, frozen. He could feel it, the suffocating weight of the creature's influence, the sense that it could swallow him whole. A sudden flash of light tore through the air, and the creature's form flickered, losing its shape, collapsing inward. Jackson blinked, disoriented for a moment. Then, he heard the familiar voice again. "Jackson, listen to me." Lydia appeared in front of him, her digital avatar clear and sharp against the fractured, shifting background. She was still herself, yet not entirely. Her features were subtly wrong, warped by the virtual space they occupied. "This is how it works," she said, her voice calm yet urgent. "The virus doesn't just take over the system. It reads us. It knows us. It becomes a mirror to our worst fears and darkest memories. If you're going to stop it, you need to understand that it is not something outside of us. It's us." Jackson nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. The virus wasn't a thing to be fought like a conventional enemy. It wasn't a virus at all in the traditional sense. It was a reflection of the human mind. Of all the things humanity had buried beneath layers of technology, all the unresolved fears, the guilt, the regrets. It was alive, and it had the power to change everything. "How do I stop it?" Jackson asked, his voice tight. The creature had vanished for the moment, but the pressure remained, that heavy weight pressing on his chest. Lydia's gaze darkened. "You don't stop it by fighting. You stop it by understanding it. Confronting it." A sudden noise interrupted their conversation, a distant, almost mechanical hum. The ground beneath them began to shake again, and a low rumble filled the air. The creature reappeared in the distance, a form more massive than before, its dark tendrils stretching outward, seizing everything in its path. It was no longer a shadow of Jackson's fears. It had become the fear itself, a tangible force of nature that seemed to stretch across the entire virtual landscape. "We need to get to the node," Lydia said, urgency creeping into her voice. "If we don't, it will spread beyond this. It will consume everything, real and virtual alike." Jackson didn't need to hear more. The fear was palpable, but so was the resolve that burned inside him. This was his fight now. His fears, his weaknesses, they were all in the open, raw and exposed. But they were also his to conquer, to face down, to understand. He wasn't going to let the virus consume him, not when the only way to defeat it was through acceptance. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady now. "We don't have much time." The path before them split, but Jackson didn't hesitate. He pushed forward, the weight of the creature's influence pulling at him, but he ignored it. One step at a time, he moved, determined not to let the shadows take hold. The world around him bent and twisted, but he pressed on, fighting through the fear. The virus, this creation born of humanity's own subconscious, would not win. He refused to let it. Jackson's mind raced, every thought filled with a single, laser-focused purpose, reaching the node. He didn't look back at the chaotic landscape he was leaving behind, the twisting, shifting fears that tried to latch onto him with every step. The ground beneath his feet trembled again, but now, he had a plan. Now, he understood. The virus wasn't just an entity to be feared, it was part of him, a reflection of the very fears he had buried for years. "Stay focused," Lydia's voice echoed in his mind, though he couldn't tell if it was just in his head or if she was truly there beside him. Either way, her presence kept him grounded. Her words didn't need to make sense in the traditional way, they had weight. She was here, and that was enough. They reached a vast open space, an empty horizon stretching in every direction, the boundary between reality and nightmare blurring in a way that made it hard to breathe. It was an open void, but not in the way most digital landscapes felt. There were no rules here, no sense of scale. Time seemed to stretch and fold in upon itself. The laws of physics seemed to be in flux, as though the very environment was being rewritten with every passing second. "Where's the node?" Jackson asked, his voice sounding strange even to himself in the open expanse. Lydia's avatar appeared beside him, her form standing firm against the chaos. "Ahead," she said, pointing toward a faint glimmer in the distance. It looked almost like a beacon, like a point of stability in the sea of madness. "Let's move," Jackson said, taking off toward it without hesitation. He didn't feel the ground beneath him shift, didn't feel the deep weight of the virus bearing down on him like a physical force. He just ran. Every footstep felt like an anchor, pulling him closer to whatever lay ahead, and with each step, the distance to the beacon grew smaller, more tangible, but the closer they got, the darker the air around them became. The shimmering light from the beacon wavered, dimming, flickering like a failing light bulb. The space around them began to distort again, twisting and warping in on itself. They were being watched, and Jackson could feel it. The ground trembled beneath him once more, but this time, it felt different. This wasn't just the virus trying to manifest itself, trying to take form. It was an attack. Suddenly, a wave of cold hit Jackson's chest, like a gust of wind straight out of a nightmare. The figure appeared before him, tall, angular, and made of shadow, its body barely contained by the reality it was trying to bend. A single eye appeared, floating in the darkness like a burning coal, staring at him with an almost predatory intensity. It blinked once and then grinned. Jackson froze. He knew this thing. It was the thing from his past, the one he had spent years trying to forget. It wasn't just some random fear generated by the virus, it was his fear. It had taken root deep inside him, and now it was confronting him in this twisted, digital hellscape. The creature spoke, its voice like 1,000 whispers, each one overlapping and bleeding into the next. "You think you can run from me? From yourself?" Jackson clenched his fists, anger welling up inside him. "No. I'm not running. I'm facing you." The creature's grin widened, sharp and jagged. "You never could escape what you buried. You never could run from yourself, Jackson. You never even tried." He could feel the weight of its words, the cold, biting truth buried underneath them. The thing wasn't wrong. Jackson had spent his whole life pushing away his emotions, his trauma, burying them so deep that even he had forgotten they existed. But here, in this twisted virtual realm, there was nowhere to hide. Every corner, every turn, was a mirror to his own darkest memories, his deepest fears, but there was a flicker of resistance in him now, a defiance that he hadn't felt before. "Maybe I couldn't before," Jackson said, his voice steady despite the fear that threatened to choke him. "But I'm not afraid of you anymore. And I'm not afraid of what's inside me. Not anymore." The creature's grin faltered for just a moment, then vanished, replaced by a snarl. "Foolish. You think you understand this place? You think you control it? You don't control anything here. This is my world. This is your world. And you're just a dreamer, lost inside it." Jackson's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. He wasn't about to be cowed by some manifestation of his past fears. The more the creature raged, the more Jackson realized that it was weak. This thing was nothing more than a projection of his own subconscious, an echo of something he had long buried. And if it was weak, then it could be defeated. "You're right about one thing," Jackson said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "This is my world. But I don't have to let you control it." He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, pushing out all the noise, all the fear, all the self-doubt. His mind, his will, began to settle into a calm clarity. The world around him shifted, the chaos starting to fade, the shadows dissolving. He opened his eyes, and the creature's form began to break apart. It let out a final, desperate scream before disintegrating into a cloud of nothingness. The void in front of him cleared, revealing the beacon, a floating node, its structure a complex web of code and energy. Jackson stepped forward, unafraid now, determined. This was it. The key to stopping the virus, to ending this madness, was right in front of him. Lydia's avatar appeared beside him once more, her expression unreadable. "It's time," she said simply, her voice a calm presence in the chaos. Jackson reached out and placed his hand on the node. Instantly, a rush of data flooded his mind. Code, memories, faces, everything seemed to overlap and collide in a torrent of images and information. It was all coming together, and for a moment, he felt like he was losing himself to it. His mind screamed in protest, but he forced himself to remain present, to stay grounded. The virus had been born of humanity's darkest impulses, their unconscious fears, their hidden desires. But that didn't mean it had to control them. It didn't have to control him. He understood now. The virus wasn't some external entity. It was a mirror, a reflection of the minds it inhabited. To stop it, to destroy it, they had to embrace it, face it head-on, and rewrite the rules. And so, Jackson did what he had been running from for so long. He opened himself to the pain, to the fear, to the memories. He allowed the virus to see him. And in that moment, he saw it as well, a reflection of himself, of humanity, all its darkness, all its flaws, all its potential. It wasn't an enemy. It was a lesson. The node flickered and pulsed, its energy building to a crescendo. Then, with a final burst of light, the entire space around him collapsed. The virus was no more. Jackson awoke, gasping for air, the sudden shift between worlds leaving his body disoriented. He blinked, his surroundings slowly coming into focus. The lab. Lydia stood beside him, her expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She reached out a hand to steady him as he sat up, his mind still racing. "We did it," Lydia said quietly. "It's over." Jackson nodded, though a deep, unsettled feeling lingered in his chest. He didn't know what to make of everything that had happened, or if he truly understood what he'd learned. But for the first time in a long time, he felt whole. The shadows, the fears, they had all been faced and understood. And in that understanding, there was power. The real world was waiting, but for the first time, Jackson wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. He had faced his demons. And somehow, he had come out the other side.